Hey guys, welcome to this GigaOm webinar, making the right call for multi-cloud solutions. My name is David Linthicum with GigaOm, and we have a great panel for you today, which is really going to talk about what's core to everybody's mind, and certainly everybody that I talk to out in the cloud computing space is how do you make the right decisions for how to, in essence, configure and deploy a multi-cloud. We're living in a complex world now. We're no more single cloud solutions. We're dealing with legacy systems, private clouds, IoT-based systems, edge-based computing, and sometimes as many as 2 or 3 and sometimes 4 public clouds are in the mix. And the reality is that we're going for an optimized architecture. Your ability to, in essence, pick the right technology to get close to 100% optimization in terms of cost efficiency, in terms of your ability to, in essence, serve the business needs, all these things kind of come into play. And the concern I think that we all have is that we're picking the wrong technology, picking the unoptimized solutions. And even though with enough money and time, we can make everything work, there's really no reason to spend some millions, and I would say in some cases, billions of dollars on picking the wrong solution. So we're going to talk about and dig into this problem today. So joining me today is my special panel. First, Bobby Allan, CTO and evangelist with CloudGenera. How you doing, Bobby?
Doing well, David. Thanks again for having me on the program.
So what's your background? What do you bring to this discussion in terms of how we pick technology and solutions for multi-cloud and cloud computing in general?
Right. So for one, David, I'm someone who's actually been in the world of cloud computing startups for the past 7 years. Been through acquisitions, helped lots of major enterprises as they kind of wrestled with multi-cloud strategy. And before that, did large stints in financial services and technology, where I was kind of on the inside of some of those large companies wrestling with tech. So kind of seeing both sides of it, kind of as a consultant, but then also as a practitioner inside the company, trying to leverage technology to best meet the needs of the business.
And also like to welcome William, but we're going to call him Bill Giard, and he's the CTO Digital Transformation and Scale Solution Data Platforms Group at Intel. Bill, how you doing? And same question for you. What do you bring to the table in terms of this discussion? What are your preferences? What are your biases?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. So, I currently lead the overall server and infrastructure teams here in our data center group at Intel. And, really our focus, in that discussion centers on, how do we optimize the cloud architectures, the software solutions that run on them, whether it's, in the public cloud and, on-premise or a hybrid and multi-cloud environment. But prior to that work, where I spend really the majority of my time really optimizing cloud architectures and solutions, my background is 20 years in enterprise IT, leading app and software development, some very large ones, systems, several thousand deployments here in our own Intel environment, but also with customers and just optimizing software and solutions to go run where our customers need them. And, a lot of insights on how those solutions work, what's, the best practices for deploying and really that migration from, traditional infrastructures to cloud architectures is really where we see, a heavy focus and where I've spent the majority of my time over the last 20 plus years.
Well, Bobby and Bill, we're going to pick your brains. You're going to be very tired after the next 50 minutes, so I hope you're prepared. So what we're going to talk about during this webinar is, what is market data telling you and how do you understand what's right for the market versus right for you? And that is a huge issue, and I'm looking forward to dig into that. Also, what are the CIOs, the CTOs, and the CEOs bringing up? And how do you sell ultimately to a board of directors? Those are the people approving the budgets, and you have to put together a business case that they're going to accept. And then also we're going to get some insider views on creating cloud solutions, in essence, from selection to operations, your ability to pick the right solutions, your ability to kind of get beyond the hype in terms of what's optimized for your particular categories. And then we're going to talk about best practices, and you really should be paying attention to that. And so hang around for that discussion in terms of what you need to do to take your solution to the next level. Also, there's an opportunity for you, the listener, to ask questions. So please, during this discussion, go ahead and type questions into the questions panel on your GoToWebinar screen, and we'll get them to them in the last 10 minutes of the presentation. So let's go ahead and go. So first, we're going to go ahead and do a poll. What expectations of data, or what are your expectations of data in assisting you in selecting the right solution? A high, B medium, C low, D not sure. So Bobby, I'll go to you first. What do you think are going to be the take from this webinar? What do you think is going to be the first, second, third choice of the attendees here?
People are probably going to say high, then medium, then low in that order, but that's very different than what we see in the field, and I'm sure we'll talk about that later. But I'm going to assume that we have folks that are optimistic in terms of how much data can help them make the right decision, and so they're probably going to answer that way.
Bill, you agree with Bobby?
I do. I think people want data to be able to make a data-driven decision. I think, a lot of people may raise questions on how do I get the right data to actually effectively help guide them in their decision. So that may influence really that high, medium, not sure score, as they understand, hey, they like data, but they want to understand how to actually get better data to really drive acceleration.
Yeah, I'm going to be a bit of a contrarian here. I think it's going to be medium, low, and high because ultimately, I think that people rely on data, but they really kind of rely on their own business requirements and the preferences that they have, and are really kind of the expectations they have in the field. So we're going to give you guys about another 30 seconds, so we're going to go ahead and close the poll down. So, what can we learn from data, Bobby? What are, if these are data-driven decisions, and we're using research to, in essence, get to the solutions that are optimized for our particular problem domains? Where do we find the data? How do we use it? What kind of processes should we consider when we're going through it?
So David, if you allow me, I want to kind of be a little bit adjacent to your question. I think it's a great question, but I think there's a bigger issue that's hiding here, which is that a lot of enterprises want to have data-driven discussions, not data-driven decisions. They want to look at a lot of data, they want to talk about it, they want to pontificate on it. And one of the things that I'm finding in the enterprise is the enterprise is paying for expertise, recommendations, and consulting they have no intention of acting on. And so in many cases, you have enterprises that have done study after study, recommendation after recommendation. They're drowning in data. And when you look over the years, the dead bodies are there because folks are frustrated because they haven't done anything with any of it. So I think that's really one of the first things that is an issue is I often challenge companies, let's be realistic about what you are really willing and able to change, because let's not have a study or an assessment assuming that the world is a white piece of paper and that you're going to do anything in the world if you know that all you're really willing to do is turn off half a switch off of one LAN in the data center. So that's the first disconnect I guess I would address.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. We're going to go ahead and hit that in the forthcoming slides. So we got the results, and medium's 41%. High is 47%, medium's 41%, low is 12%, and not sure 0%. So I think you and Bill were right, Bobby, and I was off as well. So I guess this is aligned with our expectations, what the audience is going to leverage and how they're leveraging their technology and leveraging data to pick it. What do you think, Bill?
I think it's good, right? I think people want data. They want data that's meaningful to them, right? There's a spectrum, right? I think, getting into, data that's meaningful to their business, there's really two forms of it. Hey, they want to understand the experiences of their peers, right? How can they learn from their peers and partners and, trusted advisors, but also, more specifically, how does it relate to their own business, right? And data, in their own organizations and balance that.
So I'll get to the first topic. What is the market data telling you, and how do you understand what's right for the market versus what's right for you? And this is kind of a key question, because I think ultimately people are driven by kind of where the hype's going. And I used to call it managed by magazine 20 years ago when there were a lot more magazines around, but in essence, people will move toward wherever the minions are moving. It's almost like a kid's soccer game where there's no strategy. The ball's just getting kicked around the field and everybody's running after the ball. And, we ran after distributed objects in the past. We ran after PC client server systems in the past. We ran after intranet and web-based development in the past, distributed computing in the past, and then more recently, containers and serverless and IoT and edge-based computing, things like that. And it's great, I think, to understand where the technology is going and what role the technology can play. But I get a bit concerned when people are mismatching the technology or dragging technology into the organization without really a clear understanding of how the technology is going to be employed. Am I being too skeptical, Bobby?
No, I think you're spot on, David. So one of the things that I see a lot when folks talk about a lot of the, platform type things that we talk about at conferences, here's a great use case for public cloud, for example. We're too often talking about the new school companies, right? The media streaming companies, the video gaming companies. Talk to me about the insurance company or the bank with data from the past 50 or 60 years. And so what I'm finding that the market is saying is that if I have a white piece of paper, I'm going to build a brand new greenfield application in the cloud, leveraging all the latest and greatest stuff. But it's not necessarily worth my time and effort as an executive to migrate that legacy app with 50 years of data in it. The juice isn't necessarily worth the squeeze, if you will. I'm going to just kind of run that in isolation, kind of do the bare minimum enhancements that I've got to, but I'm not going to invest the time and the effort to move that. That's number one. Number two, something else that's very real, repatriation is not just a term. It is a real thing that we're seeing. There are workloads that have been moved to public cloud, sometimes prematurely, that are often moved back, not necessarily to the data center, but maybe to one of those regional private providers. So those are two of the misconceptions I think people might be surprised about how prevalent those are. Those come up in almost every conversation I have with executive leadership.
Bill, what are your experiences?
Well, I think over the last 2 years, we've gotten a lot more clarity in the industry and the market around, enterprise cloud strategy, right? A couple of years ago, we were all grappling with is everything, moving to a public cloud, right? We saw, a tremendous amount of momentum to do that, which we were very pleased to see. But what we saw, really now, right, is on average, enterprise organizations anywhere from 5 to 9, different, cloud solutions. And they recognize that they also need, their own data center. They've certainly consolidated and taken advantage of cloud architectures to, either reduce the number of data centers, but, have larger deployments. But it's clearly a hybrid cloud world for sure. And it's multiple public clouds. And, we see just really almost a 100% consistent recognition from every one of the CIOs and CXOs that I talk to around that, and from our partners. And we've seen that the shift in public cloud providers, offering on-premise capabilities. Every one of them has a strategy there. So it really is a hybrid multi-cloud world, that people are locking onto and implementing.
One of the things that strikes me is, and I wrote an article in my blog on InfoWorld, 3 or 4 weeks ago, and entitled "Why Your Cloud Architect is Probably Underpaid." And the reality is that all of these patterns and basically what leads to success and what leads to failure really kind of sits in the heads of all these men and women out there who in essence are assembling these solutions. And right now we're at a crisis state because we don't have enough of these men and women to go around, people who are skilled at not just understanding how AWS works and Microsoft works and Google works, but how they all work and play well together, creating common security layers, common governance layers, and the ability to kind of get a solution that's going to have some scalability and remove a lot of the complexity from the solution. And so what can we do to fix this, Bobby? I mean, are there steps that companies can take, colleges can take? Should the government take control of this? Where do we go?
Yeah, that's a great question, David. I think some of it is, again, we're so new, we have to give people time to kind of learn and to play around. I often say the cloud is at best a teenager that just learned how to drive. It's very capable, but it needs some boundaries. And I think that applies to the proficiency of a lot of the architects and engineers in using different solutions, right? So if I'm a leader, I want to take some of my, top aces and allow them some time to play around in the different sandboxes. Here's a problem, solve that in cloud provider 1, cloud provider 2, cloud provider 3, and, kind of compare and contrast the pros and the cons and let those key learnings kind of come back. I'm not seeing enough of that happening. I'm seeing app team 1 goes to this provider because somebody went to a conference, or app team 2 goes to that one because they have a certain inclination towards that. They're not really comparing notes with similar problems to see, which provider satisfied that pattern the best.
Bill, save us.
I think that experiences and trial and error really drives the way, right? I think, it really starts with a good business conversation around the strategy that the CXO is having, a deep understanding of the applications that run their business, right? I spent, really 20 years on the enterprise app software side of the house and deploying those across infrastructures, not only in our own internal data centers, but in our external environments, and understanding, the needs of the end user and how that application functions and how to, move that towards cloud technologies, the interfaces that it has to other systems and the dependencies you have, really that data-driven understanding of how the application is running their business and where the business is going, right? Whether it's a factory application that has really low latency requirements, or it's a sales application that enables a mobile sales force that really runs global, plays a central part in understanding how the application will function, in the cloud, and when you move it towards public cloud, or where you just internally, adopt, cloud technologies to help your on-premise function. So, that strategy starts with the business conversation, and it starts with a deep understanding of how the application runs your business and where you want it to go.
I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. It is going to be a bit of trial and error. It is truly the fact that we're still trying to figure this stuff out. People haven't run every combination of cloud systems out there. We have to kind of figure out how things are going to work or optimize by, in essence, making mistakes. But it's very difficult, and I talk to a lot of board of directors and a lot of CIOs and CTOs and CEOs, to go in there and say we're going to do something with trial and error. They'll walk you to the edge of the property. How do we sell this effectively, Bill?
I think the right answer, or at least the recommendation I would give, because there's no one answer that fits everybody, is start with the ones that make sense. Understand where your data lives, right? Understand how you can maximize that, and really that data, we call it data gravity, but if you're producing data in your own factory, then it probably makes sense to start there on optimizing the infrastructure. If your data gets produced, via sensing networks or video infrastructure or retail data in the public cloud, it probably makes sense to start there, and really that first understanding of where the data is getting created and then where it gets consumed is probably the first litmus test to be able to understand where you should be optimizing and driving towards.
So let's get on to the next topic, and that is, what are the CXOs, CEOs, CTOs, anybody who's in essence in a leadership position in the company. I say that because there's kind of, weird titles that are out there now. There's, senior vice president, in charge of cloud engineering, and senior vice president in charge of cloud architecture, and senior vice president, in charge of data. And we're getting very specific in our roles. And so what are some of the questions that we're seeing out there that you keep hearing about in your business, Bobby, and how do we address them?
So one of the questions that comes up is just multi-cloud, right? How important is multi-cloud? How important should it be? And what I'll say is, what the data is telling me, kind of coupled with what I'm hearing from executives, is that many people that have multi-cloud have multi-cloud portfolios, not necessarily multi-cloud applications. They don't have an application that's literally consuming 2 or 3 different public clouds at the same time. They may, however, have an application that's consuming public and private cloud at the same time. I consider that more of a hybrid app. And so the question that often comes up is, how important should the multi-cloud thing be for me? And the question that I ask them back often is, what is driving this? Is innovation driving your curiosity about multi-cloud, or fear? Are you fearing vendor lock-in? Are you fearing that you're going to lose leverage if you're kind of all in on one provider? Or do you really feel like there's differentiated value in provider C over provider B? So there's a lot of confusion there. So part of what's happening too, David, is a lot of the executives, Bill and I have had this conversation before. I liken the cloud provider to a chef. And that chef can make whatever it is that you want, but you've got to decide what your dietary restrictions and preferences are. So if I'm a carnivore and Bill's a vegan, it's not the cloud provider's problem if they can't make a dish that is a mismatch of our preferences. We need to have a conversation and decide if we're going to have a vegan night or at least a pescatarian night to kind of meet in the middle. But we're not communicating well across those different executive functions at the company to ask for what it is that we want. We're throwing stuff over the wall and expecting the cloud provider to kind of be a magic bullet for all those things that we haven't reconciled.
I think that's a great response. Bill, do you have anything to add?
I think Bobby's spot on around, how do you use it correctly? I hear 3 conversations from the CXO. One, used to be almost all centered on, cost, right? Cost of movement, cost optimizations. that conversation has really changed towards, speed and agility. How can I move fast, adopt the latest set of technologies, keep up with the competition, and really use those advanced set of services, right? Analytics, cloud native, things that give them business insights faster. And so we've pivoted away from cost largely towards agility, and certainly cost is in every conversation that we have. But really the speed of consumption of those services, how can they get their applications moving and releasing faster? How can they modernize more quickly? And then the third discussion that is certainly coming up quite heavily, certainly with the regulatory and the financial systems, what we see across the board is security. Security comes up almost in every single conversation around, as we adopt and define our cloud strategy, how are we meeting our, not only internal corporate, security and InfoSec requirements and protect the data, but also, the conversation with, certainly regulated industries in healthcare and financial. How are we meeting the regulatory requirements for how we manage the data? And, we see, regulatory and security, requirements just coming up almost every day. Every conversation we have centers around speed and security, probably predominantly.
So I just read a study this morning that came across the newswire where most financial executives still don't trust the cloud, even in 2019, moving into 2020. Are we having pushback still where there's kind of a aggressive and passive aggressive conduct in how we're looking at modernizing existing IT infrastructure, leveraging cloud computing? Is there some sort of fear that's getting in the way of making these decisions? I'll go to you, Bobby, first.
I think absolutely, David. I think nobody wants to be the person that has their name in the paper. As you and Bill were talking just now, one of the things I took away from that is what I'm seeing is agility for greenfield, fragility for brownfield. When it's the new stuff and I don't have a burden of existing customer data and things like that, I want to go as fast as possible. When it talks about the existing bread and butter, kind of money-making applications with, decades of data, I don't want to break anything. And so in many ways, the benefit to take a legacy app and to modernize it is less attractive than just kind of maintaining and not getting my name in the paper literally because I blew up something or there was some sort of a data breach. So I think a lot of executives at these mature companies are really going to be conservative, because the other part of this is, to be quite honest, David, a lot of the executives at these mature companies, when you think about where they are career-wise, a lot of them want to ride off into the sunset and retire in the next 5 years or so. So having a data breach or, some big snafu because you moved a mature application to the cloud is just not worth it to them. They're going to let the young guns or the people that are lower in the organization fight those battles, but they're not moving the bread and butter apps because it's just not worth it.
But shouldn't board of directors hold their feet to the fire in terms of innovation? I mean, this kind of drives me nuts because you do have this kind of passive aggressive mentality within the executive team, specifically even in the finance teams, where they're concerned about adding any kind of risk to any kind of things that occur. But the reality is, if you don't add risk, you're not going to be able to get into the innovative directions, build new products and services, and really you're going to be a target for the disruptors out there. And of course, we have the Ubers and the Netflix that are the big disruptors, but we have disruption that's coming in the insurance business and healthcare and banking that's coming up from smaller players that are willing to leverage cloud computing and other technologies as a force multiplier to, in essence, disrupt the whole market. Am I wrong, Bill?
I think it's in some extent, it's really informed risk, right? I have seen a key shift from, hey, holding back, let others try first, right? What was passive aggressive behavior to now it's really practical decisions, right? There's key learnings around, how do we manage the environment, when we move it from the existing set of controls, and how do those controls change? And so what I've seen, which is a healthy discussion, is let's move the controls and just move and try to secure after the fact, as an example. But how do I do that in a very deliberate way such that we can ensure that we're protecting, the corporate data, the user's data, the customer data? And so I would say it's really informed risk right, and practical hesitancy to make sure that their organization is moving at the same speed. But I would certainly be a bigger proponent of moving faster. I think every board that I talk to and every CIO that I talk to has that imperative move faster. In fact, even at Intel, we are openly a cloud-first company, right? We want to push the cloud. We want to push the envelope. And we use that very directly and try to get every solution on the public cloud. But even in that model, we're 97% on-prem, right? And we use cloud technologies heavily. And that's because of things like performance and latency and security. How do we manage the attack surface? How do we run our factory, right? And so we use, almost every cloud provider you can imagine, heavy SaaS first, but, the things that run our core business, for very practical performance and cost reasons and security reasons, we still have a heavy balance there, right?
So that gets into a related discussion. Ultimately, this is your ability to get, many $1 million. The typical cloud transformation is going to cost between $50 to $100 million, even for a small IT shop to move. And that kind of funding needs to rise up to the board of directors, and the CIOs and the CTOs have to, in essence, sell them that this is the right thing to do, and sell them that you're going to be successful, and sell them that there's a business case for making this happen. And probably, to Bobby's point, there's some pretty nervous people, that are concerned that their legacy is going to be the company going under because of a huge breach, things like that. And so ultimately, how do you make the sell? I mean, Bobby, I'm sure you've done this a few times in your career, and I've done it a few times, and I'd love to get your tips.
Yes, I think part of it is, number one, there's kind of safety in numbers, in the sense that people should be willing to bring in outside help. If you're a company, especially that's been hopefully very productive, but maybe pretty ingrown, where people have been very long tenured there, which is a great thing in terms of loyalty and knowledge transfer and things like that, but you need to bring in some outside help. Let's look at some patterns we've seen in other places. But specifically, David, I wanted to raise this. One of the things that I'm seeing is that a lot of executives fear getting the wrong answer to a good question. The bigger concern should be, am I getting the right answer to the wrong question? So let me unpack that. So if I ask, for example, how much is compute going to cost me in cloud provider X? And I answer that question, that's really the wrong question. Because I'm going to tell you what the compute costs, but what I should have told you is what about all the other charges that are really going to bite you, and then now you've under budgeted for what that transformation is going to really look like. So we need to bring in help. We need to bring in partners. One of the conversations Bill and I had is, I believe a product is good, a plan is better, a partner is best. I want someone who's going to be in it with me, not just selling me something or throwing it over the wall. I want to benefit from where you've seen this movie before, and you can help keep me from hitting every single landmine myself. That's how I think you sell to leadership.
Bill, how do you sell leadership?
I do think leveraging experience, I totally agree with Bobby on the fact that, hey, those that have done the journey before versus who are coming in with something brand new, sell experience and understanding of how they've done it before with other customers is critical. The second one is quite directly, what is the financial return, either in being able to deploy faster and get to market quicker, right? To be able to deliver new capabilities with new AI technologies, or cost savings by adoption, and having that real good practical conversation that says, here's what it's going to take to uplift the application, right? Are you writing new? Are you taking advantage, and you can reduce your development costs by taking advantage of some of these cloud native services? Can you reduce your infrastructure costs by modernizing that on-prem? And what's the total cost of rewriting the application, including interfaces? So really, get a partner that has done that before, who understands your existing infrastructure, and can help you give the comprehensive view, because you don't want surprises at the board level that says, hey, we took longer or it took more money to make the move, right? So having that, really good conversation and a good plan based off experiences, I think, is critical.
David, if I can, I want to piggyback on something Bill said that's really important.
Sure.
One of the things that's not happening enough in the boardroom is for someone to be honest and say, going to the cloud is going to cost us more money. And here's why I say that, right? So my kids are 11 and 13. Soon they're going to be in college one day. And so there's a point in time where the son or the daughter moves out and you're paying for your house, but you're still paying for college. Your cost did not go down yet. They will eventually when they're off of mom and dad's payroll, but in the beginning, you're actually paying for two places. And that's really how a lot of cloud transformations go. And because we're trying to sell something to the board so hard sometimes, we give unrealistic expectations around how much we're going to save on cost. And the reality is you can't turn stuff off until the last tenant gets off of that server or out of that data center. Those upfront expectation setting conversations would help a lot of this go better later, in my opinion.
Totally agree.
I think that's an excellent point. Let's kind of elaborate on that, because I do think that it's spinning that people are doing to the board that's setting expectations that are in essence unrealistic. I don't know how many times I've come in to projects that are 2 years old and they haven't lived up to the expectations that were set, back in 2017, even 2018, where in essence they were looking to fund things. The word self-funding keeps coming up, the ability for us to count on saving money from cloud-based usage that we can back up to fund the project migration to the cloud. That never works. And so the realistic expectation that we're going to have to lubricate this with a lot of cash is something that I don't think that people really understand. So what's your take on this, Bill?
I agree. I think it does require some level of uplift and being realistic. I mean, the worst conversations you have with the board is, hey, we didn't meet what we told you we were going to do, right? So being open and direct around, here's what it's going to take initially, and here's how we're going to measure whether we're moving the dial, whether that's in, releasing of solutions to the market, right? Increased, application, release times or uptime or cost. I think, get the small measurements, right? But be realistic about the upfront cost and then measure the progress towards the long-term revenue goals, right? Or business objectives, I think is really the right way to approach it. Because the worst conversation you want to have is, here's what we told you we're going to do, and here's how we're either taking longer or we're costing more, and you just want to address that up front and hit the smaller measurements and be successful and have that long-term conversation.
So Bobby, how many times a month do you have conversations about what cloud is actually going to cost and what solutions that they need to leverage? And how many times is it considered bad news when the cost is higher than people expect? And what would be your advice as to where they can, in essence, take that information? Is it take it or leave it? This is what it costs? Or can we kind of back it down to, pet projects, extend things out? What are the options here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's a great question, David. So one of the challenges that folks have is they're looking, we're hopefully evolving past this pretty soon, but a lot of people are looking at moving the entire data center or moving the entire private cloud. And the reality is that conversations are happening at the application level. And so we have those conversations at CloudGenera literally every week where folks are engaging us multiple times a week, sometimes multiple times a day, to talk to CXOs and IT directors about, I've got X apps that I want to move to cloud. I want to understand, is it best to deploy them in this public provider? Which things should go here? Which things should go there? And so we want to make sure that we're looking at the data. So CloudGenera has a software solution that looks at a whole bunch of different dimensions. We've got years worth of data, hundreds of thousands of scorecards that we produce and assessments that we've done that kind of inform a lot of the things we've been talking about today. So we have this conversation all the time. But what's come out of that, David, is there are some heuristics that I think are pretty interesting that come out. So I'm going to borrow one from a professor I had in grad school. He used to say that the last 10% of a software project is going to be 50% of the effort. And I would argue that same mantra applies pretty closely to how things go in terms of migration projects and transformation. The last 10% of the apps is probably going to be 50% of the effort and the cost. The first app is easy. The last app is excruciating to get that one out of the data center to kind of cut the lights off, so to speak.
So Bill, anything to add before we move on to the next topic?
Yeah, I mean, I'll add, I'll accelerate our discussion and give you some practical indicators that I've seen work, right? When you're having that discussion, at least from an IT, and they start with, IT operational indicators that really, IT and most are cost centers, right? They're measured on their success to support and run the business. And the first thing that we measure on our cloud journey, where I've seen people have success, is, hey, how are we operating, right? What's the application failure rate? What's the number of call that we have for, in our journey to cloud modernization? And what we've seen pretty consistently, if you're focusing on not only application, increasing the release rate, right? So that you're not getting a once a year release and you're moving to that, release every 4 to 6 weeks or whatever faster cadence. Are you releasing faster while reducing your overall, support tickets, right? And that is a very practical one that we've seen tremendous amount of success as you modernize the application to cloud architectures. The second one that I would add into that is that we saw, and it was a surprise to a lot of organizations, as they adopt consistent services, the time in which they can, address what is, their response time to security events, right? Whether it's patching compliance in a cloud architecture, it's much more easy to do that. And those compliance to your standard operational indicators ends up being a good leading indicator to the end goal of cost savings, right? So add a couple of those operational indicators while you continue to monitor and manage cost.
Yeah, so we beat up the problems to death, exactly what we're facing when we're, looking at boards of directors and dealing with CXOs or even dealing with operational players in terms of providing them the right advice in terms of picking and deploying the right technology. Now let's get to brass tacks. Let's give actual advice out there. So one, Bobby, I'll go to you first because I know this is a huge part of your business. What is the inside baseball secrets for selecting the best solution? Looking at everything from security to databases to storage to management monitoring, governance, ops tools, DevOps integration, things like that. It just seems to be a huge complex array of things that are going to be in some instances mutually exclusive. And it seems like your ability to select something that's optimized is almost going to be an impossibility. So that's a tough question. I'll give it to you first.
Yeah, I think continuous optimization has to be one of the first things that we strongly consider. The analogy that I often use for cloud is like looking at airline tickets. We would never pull up a plane ticket schedule from 6 months ago and think that was accurate today, but we do that in cloud and then wonder why it's biting us. So one of the things that we do is we look at, we automatically suck in the information from the major cloud providers. And so we know the 1,000 things that cloud provider A changed last night or the 500 things that cloud provider B changed. When there was a major conference recently for one provider, our team noticed, for example, David, that another provider actually slipped in a 60% price increase with things that decreased. So I think the first thing is you have to leverage automation because this problem is too big to do in a spreadsheet. There's something like 45,000 ways to run a VM in one of the major public providers today. You cannot keep up with that manually or with a spreadsheet. So leverage automation, have a process to continually optimize that at least quarterly, I would recommend, right? Because stuff is changing all around you. And if you're resting on architectural choices that you made 6 months ago, you're going to be in the same spot or same place and be in the wrong spot because things have changed all around you. One low-hanging fruit that I'll also offer, David, is I think people need to have a partner that can help them figure out when to move up and down the stack. And here's what I mean. We're still struggling in many ways with infrastructure as a service because we at least know what that is, virtual machines and things like that. And we want to flirt with PaaS options and SaaS options. The automation that helps you make a selection should also let you know when do I go from running a database myself to something like a database as a service. That's something that our software actually helps with. And we evaluate compute, storage, labor licensing, things like that to say moving from IaaS to PaaS makes sense. That's what I'd recommend. Scale in terms of the automation, so you've got the breadth of data, but then also depth of data to tell you don't buy a faster horse. Now it's time to buy a car.
I would add, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Bill. I'm sorry.
Okay, I would add, probably the first key that I've seen for successful cloud movement centers on engaging the business, right? It's not just an infrastructure initiative. It's got to be an infrastructure plus business initiative, right? And that really typically means infrastructure and operations along with the application teams. Bobby alluded to that a bit with applications, but where I've seen the most success is really where those two teams, the application and the business owner, comes together with the infrastructure and IT operation teams to really drive that forward and have a concerted conversation. I've seen cloud initiatives fail early if the business drove a complete cloud away from their infrastructure and IT team, or if the IT team just pushed a cloud initiative without engaging the application and business owners. So it really has to be a joint initiative, with those measures of success to really drive it and move it forward. And it means really engaging the developers, right? Engaging, the teams that are maintaining it, because you don't want surprises with respect to, interfaces or data management or availability and uptime, and measure those quite deliberately on the pace in which you can deploy, those solutions into production.
So just to reflect on Bobby's point that was made a minute ago, automate. I mean, ultimately, there are cost governance tools. There are solution selection tools like Bobby's company sells. There are other research tools out there, so you'll understand exactly what the solution patterns are and map them into your problem patterns. And I think that we're missing that science today, because I think we're probably overwhelmed with the number of choices that we have. We're probably overwhelmed with the amount of information that's available to us. We're probably overwhelmed with what we think the cost advantages are versus what they tend to be in reality. I mean, I've had clients that get very good deals on storage systems, very good deals on compute, but their ingress and egress costs of data, are going to be 90% of their bill, and it's way out of whack in terms of what their budget spent. And the reality is that they did some advanced planning and leveraged some cost governance tools, those issues wouldn't have been so apparent. And the ability to look at all of the fundamentals of doing this, deal with a common security layer, common governance layer, common management and monitoring layer, dealing with cognitive integration, all the things that are popping up today. So we're not reinventing the wheel, every time we have a cloud project that has an individual sprint that occurs, that are decoupled from the other projects that aren't necessarily coming together on common services they should leverage. So take that as advice. So cloud selection, ultimately, what are the three, insider tips that people should consider? And this time I'll go to you, Bill, first, then I'll go to Bobby.
Sure. I think, first of all is understand, the current environment, right? So when you're selecting a cloud technology, do you need some of those advanced AI solutions? You need some of the, developer services for, modern, transactional development with container services or transactional services. And then understand how to adopt those, right? So engage with the development team that says, here's what they're doing today. Here's how they're delivering, and addressing their user needs, and here's the services they want to advance, and what do they want to do in the application. So the first one is engage with the app and the developer teams to say, here's the technologies that you want to adopt and deploy into your application. And then they'll typically give you a good pointer to says, hey, we need X, Y, or Z either on our own cloud infrastructure, or we need that in a public cloud technology, or we want to take advantage of this SaaS service. So the first one is, engage, the development teams and the app teams to understand what technologies they want to move the application to. The second one really is understand, and I mentioned this before, where the data, what's the volume of data that I have to move, right? How do I either move that data to take advantage and connect the data to those new services they're deploying, and really comprehend what the cost, right, to your ingress and egress cost, to the data storage cost in the cloud environment, et cetera, and understand the data cost, either from a movement or storage perspective. And then the third one, really centers on the number of interfaces that they have and where the users reside. And understand, hey, when I'm selecting a cloud platform, am I putting it in a location where either it needs to be close to another system, right, or it's close to the user, and understand, the level of work to go move that, right, to be able to connect it to the places, either to the users, to the other systems that they need it. And that really will give you a blueprint for, hey, should this be, using these technologies on-prem? Should I be using these, services in the public cloud, and how do I connect those? And that really gives you a good, framework for driving that decision. And that's where technologies like you have with CloudGenera can help you with some of those data and performance indicators with my performance requirements. But those are types of the things that, you're really getting into where we started the conversations is how can that, inform the decision, help accelerate their cloud selection.
Bobby, your 3 tips.
So I'm going to go a little bit different. I agree with everything Bill said based on some of the stuff I see in the field. I'm going to start with software licensing, David. That's one of the ones that I think people look at too late, way too often. right? Provider A versus provider B. If let's just assume that you're strictly looking at public cloud options for the sake of this part of the question. Have you evaluated, where do your licenses for your operating systems, your databases, your application software? In one provider, you got to buy that stuff all over again. And in another provider, you can kind of take it with you. That makes a huge difference. And what ends up happening is people typically make a selection of where they want to run stuff without really looking at how much the stack above the operating system or really above the hypervisor is going to cost them. So I would start with that. The other question I would look at is who has the best path to transition you from where you are to what you want. And so I'll use a database example. Maybe today you're running a relational proprietary database, and then you want to move to an open source relational database, and then eventually you want to kind of fracture that off to NoSQL, time series, graph databases, things like that. Think about where you've got a safe landing spot and you can kind of land and expand and take on innovation. Some people have very cool stuff right now, but there's no bridge between where you are and where you're going. And then the other one that I would consider, and this is one of the concepts Bill mentioned, is data gravity. Is there going to be a provider or partner that will let me move the compute to the data rather than the other way around, right? And that's a newer concept that I think the industry is starting to talk about. Moving the data, you're gonna hit the speed of light and physical limitations, but moving the compute to the data may be something that's a new paradigm. So think about the providers that'll let you look at those three things: software licensing, transition path, and moving compute to the data versus the other way around.
I think both of you gave us some of the best solid advice I think we've ever had on any of these webinars. So you folks who are listening out there, maybe go back 5 minutes and play it back. If you're listening live, go back to the replay, and if you're listening to the replay, go back 5 minutes to listen to what was just said. I think that's going to be important information for you to take away out of this webinar. So let's go into our last and final polls. What are the best practices when considering cloud selection? Picking a cloud provider first, pick a process and a framework first, consider security first, consider governance. So please pick one, and we'll go ahead and launch your poll now. So Bobby, I go to you first. What do you think is going to be 1, 2, and 3?
I think that this audience will say choose security first. Security or governance. I'm going to go with one of those two is going to be first. And I think picking the cloud provider first is probably going to be last.
Bill, what do you think?
I think security is top of mind, right? But, I think a lot of people have an understanding of their preferred cloud partner today. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see the cloud provider first kind of pop up. It's not what I would recommend, but I think it's what a lot of organizations, they pick what they know, right? I would certainly agree with Bobby that, hey, understand the security, understand the data, the guidance before, but I think a lot of people may jump towards, what they know first, right?
Yeah, I think the right answer here, in my experience, is pick a process and framework first. And of course, I wrote this poll question. But the thing is, everybody loves to lead with technology and leads with tools. And when I show up, probably 75 to 80, 90% of the time, people have already picked a cloud provider when they haven't really understood their core requirements and what their security needs are and their application needs are and their platform needs are, which is a bit of a conundrum, because in essence, you're trying to fit a solution that's been predetermined and perhaps even pre-negotiated into an existing set of application workloads that may not be optimized for those particular cloud needs. And I think that that becomes an issue going forward. Am I being overly skeptical, Bill?
Oh, I totally agree with you. I mean, I couldn't have said it better myself. I think your observations are spot on, right? I think it's risky when you're given a set of technologies and you lead with technology and then you're bound in a box, right? It's very risky, and it's oftentimes what happens, but that's where we see challenges.
What about you, Bobby?
I think everything you said is very accurate, David. I think the challenge is, I'm going to kind of contradict myself from before. There is safety in numbers in terms of bringing in a partner, but there's also safety in numbers if you feel like there are enough similar patterns in the cloud provider you're leaning towards that you can rely on, right? I can look at architecture and best practices, and so a lot of people are saying, well, if that worked for such and such company, they're similar enough to us that I'm just going to go in that direction and start to dig in and start to learn.
So we'll go ahead and look at the results and see what they say. But, I just, want to say, oh, here it is. Looks like pick a cloud first, 7%. So We're not doing that first. Hey, guess what? I was right about this one. Pick a process and a framework first, 43%. Consider security first, 14%. Consider governance, 36%, which is unusual because I guarantee you, 3-4 years ago, people didn't know what cloud governance was, and now it's, now it's a very popular topic. So I've been vindicated, and it looks like, people are moving in the right directions out there. Any observations before we leave this?
I think it's encouraging, right? I mean, yeah.
Go ahead, Bill, I'm sorry.
It is encouraging, but also I think that people who typically attend this webinar are going to be the people who are architecture first, framework first, more pragmatic thinkers. And I think that's going to skew the results a bit. And people who are typically going to pick a cloud provider first and security first typically don't attend webinars that focus on architectural solutions. So that's another observation.
Great point.
Okay, let's go ahead and move on. So let's wrap things up for the next few minutes in discussing best practices as to what's out there. And so, Bobby, I'm going to go to you first. Let's kind of wrap it up. What are the core takeaways or best practices that enterprises need to adopt right now so they can get to an optimized solution?
Well, I think one of the best practices, and this is going to sound a little cliched, is assume that everything new isn't good and everything old isn't bad. There's going to be some mix of old and new things, right? There's some old stuff you want to retain, and there's some new stuff you want to embrace. And I think what it comes down to, I'll tell this story real quick. Obviously, being in tech, sometimes you travel a whole lot. And I got to the point where I stopped cutting my grass because I realized cutting my grass is better for my wallet, not cutting my grass is better for my marriage. And what I would say as a best practice is we need to make sure we're asking the question, what do you think you're going to get from the cloud? A lot of people are adopting public cloud because they want to stop cutting their grass, they want to focus on relationships, and they want to give away things that are not differentiated value. That's not wrong because it's getting them closer to the business and to the people who are deciding what's going to make the customers happy.
And so, Bobby, you guys are in the business of getting to the correct solution, right? You're not in the business of selling things. The ability to kind of go through a process that's typically data-driven to get things to something that's optimized. Am I describing that correctly?
Yeah, you nailed it. You nailed it. And so we are taking in data from the customer, and typically, David, we work with them. We roll up our sleeves and we get in there and do it. We don't just throw a piece of software over the wall. So we take their information, we process it through our pretty robust piece of software. We're also a company that runs our software in the cloud. So we optimize our own software using our software. And then we give them information on, different execution venues, public and private, different pricing paradigms, different licensing paradigms, different levels of what we call service models, right? IaaS, PaaS, SaaS. That all runs through our engine, and then we give recommendations that they can poke holes in. The cool part about it, though, David, is the speed of it. So we've done 3,500 application assessments in an afternoon before. So a traditional consulting engagement that might take weeks, we've done multiple iterations of a company's data set in that same amount of time. They feel like they've been able to answer the what if questions very quickly and then know what they should do.
So, Bill, any best practices before we move on to questions that you can recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best practice I would recommend is really engage the application infrastructure team, right? This is why I'm so encouraged by the previous slide work. Have a process for, landing an application. Where is it going to land, either on-prem, in the public cloud, and which provider, really meets those needs? And then deploy a framework that actually uses data, right? Real data around, the existing infrastructure, where it's going to drive that, right? So that, reiterate that process and framework and have a really deliberate method in which you're deploying applications to specific environments, and just be consistent about that. Then iterate on it. Maybe start small, right? Get some trials if you haven't done it already. Most are on the journey, but define that framework and then iterate on it and get moving.
So let's go ahead and go to questions. And I got one question here that's actually, it's interesting to me as well. And so where do you guys go to get your information on some of the best practices in terms of how to do architectures? Is it books? Is it videos? Is it articles? Bobby, how do you keep up, and how do you determine where the wind is blowing in terms of cloud architectures and what best practices are, and educating yourself on what's going on?
Yeah, it's a combination of things. It's podcasts like this one, David. It's following certain folks on social media whose opinions I respect, and there are times there are direct messages on some social media platforms. Hey, how are you dealing with this problem? So I bounce things off of folks, and then I consume the content that's out there. Right, I actually prefer this time of year. And times where you have little pockets where it's a little bit slower from a customer perspective, because I consume the content from the learning platforms, and not necessarily all the way to the point of getting certifications, but keeping my hands close to the technology, digging past the marketing fluff of the new announcements. So I'm a lifetime learner. I love to be curious, and I love to kind of get as close to the tech as I can without taking away focus from customers.
Yeah, I think that's what you need to do. And it is non-traditional information sources that you have to exploit. What are your ideas, Bill?
For me, I love learning from experiences, either in partners who are deploying it well, or ones that have failed, right? And what have they learned, and how have they iterated, right? There's no such thing as permanent failure if you continue to learn and adapt. But for me, it's about really understanding what my peers are doing, what my customers are doing, and what's evolved and what's gone out, right? What has worked and what's not. And so those experiences, and the really deeply then following and understanding, hey, when you've moved, what's the scope of the movement, right? Is it Bright Star 3 users, or actually did you move a mission critical application? What did that mean? And so those experiences really drive most of my informed decision. I'm in a fortunate role here where I get to talk to a lot of customers. I get to talk to a lot of cloud providers and a lot of ISV, solution providers and SIs to go do that. But that's really the most valuable for me.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it's a common pattern that everybody on this webinar, Bobby, Bill, and myself, we deal with an enormous amount of customers and problems, and that's the only way you learn. I think that we're not writing and speaking about them as much as we did in the past, for whatever reason. And so you have to depend on people that have the experience to come in and assist you in moving things forward, mentoring, those sorts of things, getting the right talent in your organization, either hiring or consultants, is absolutely a necessity. I couldn't agree more. So anyway, I want to thank you all for attending this webinar. Please make sure to head out to gigaom.com for additional webinars and additional information on this technology, this approach, as well as everything else we cover. I would like to thank my special guests, Bobby and Bill, who did a great job. And so Bobby and Bill, I'll give you a chance to plug your companies. Bill, where should people go on the web to find out more about Intel?
If you go to either our builders or cloud.intel.com, we've got lots of information around our partners, what we're doing in our cloud providers, what we're doing for both, broad spectrum. So that's a great place to start.
Bobby, what about you?
So CloudGenera.com is our main homepage, but I want to highlight resources.cloudgenera.com, videos, white papers, case studies, lots of free resources that people can consume, including a white paper that Intel and CloudGenera collaborated on, the blueprint for multi-cloud success. Take advantage of anything there. We'd love to see if we can help you in the future.
Check those things out. Those resources are great, and keep following these guys because they know what they're doing. So until next time, best of luck in building a cloud computing architectures. We'll talk to you during the next webinar. Take good care. Bye-bye.